Hey, everybody out there in the Boss Hole Transformation Nation. This is your host, John Broer, bringing to you another installment of a TBC Flashback. I've been going back into the archives of the Boss Hole Chronicles and realizing that we have some amazing episodes, and the themes and the topics of those episodes are absolutely timeless. And I'm going to bring you one of those today. This goes back to March of 2023 when Kim Scott came on the program. It was actually a two-part episode, and I'll put the link to part 2 in the show notes. But this was a discussion around her book, Radical Candor, and she has since published a new book called Radical Respect. And the more work we are doing with managers and supervisors, these themes continue to present themselves. So I thought, man, we got to bring back this powerful message from Kim Scott. Let's jump in. The Boss Hole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode.
Kim, let me welcome you to the podcast. Hello, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I love what you all are doing, and I think our missions are very aligned.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. And as we were talking before we hit record today, it's just so very, very clear that we wish to make the influence and the impact of managers much more positive, and that it's not managers are meant to be bad people or they set out to cause harm or be boss holes. It's that sometimes they need tools and they need education. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you've created some opportunity, sharing some techniques to do that. But Kim, before we dive in, let me just share with our audience a little bit about your background, if I can.
Sure.
You're the author, most recently in March of 21, the author of your new book called Just Work, How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Build a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity and Radical Candor. We'll definitely be digging in on that. I think that the upshot of that is it's kind of like a playbook for being a kick-ass boss versus a boss hole. So we'll talk more.
Radical Candor is, yes.
Yeah. And so you also have been the CEO, coach CEOs at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter.
Not the current Twitter. I'm going to just interject.
Okay, thank you. The previous Twitter. Other tech companies, multiple other tech companies. You've lived and worked all over the world. You're a member of the faculty at Apple. You were a member, or are you currently a member?
Well, I was.
Okay.
I worked at Apple University, which is Apple's executive ed group.
You worked at AdSense or for YouTube, DoubleClick, and even along with teams at Google. Prior to that, you managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. That is right. That is resonating very strangely these days.
I bet. And you also, you have a family, you live on the West Coast, and you have the previous book too that we'll also talk about. You mentioned Radical Candor. Can we start talking first about Radical Candor, Kim? Can we dig in there?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. I think that the foreword there, become a great boss through straightforward, deeply human lessons. These are techniques that are founded on 2 guiding principles. And the principles really struck me between the eyes the first time I read your book: caring personally and challenging directly. I just want to say that radical candor is a term that, a phrase that's thrown out often. You know, people maybe haven't read the book or they have, but the how-to is very elusive. What prompted you to put pen to paper and provide this guidebook for managers? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, our mission at Radical Candor is to rid the world of bad bosses. And it's my belief that most bosses are not actually bad people, but they've had no training. There was a saying when I first got to Silicon Valley that management is neither taught nor valued. And that was a recipe for bad management.
Right.
And I think that there's a bunch of problems. Part of it is that, you know, you learn how to be a salesperson, or you learn how to be an engineer, or you learn how to be a lawyer. And there's actually not a coherent curriculum that teaches you how to be a manager. And so that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that managers are often given too much power, right? And so power corrupts, and a little, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and a little power corrupts a lot.
Mhm.
Is kind of how it goes. And so I think probably I started thinking about radical candor when I had started a software company, and I walked into the office and opened up my computer, and 10 people had emailed me the same article about how people would rather have a boss who's who's an asshole but really competent than one who's really nice but incompetent. And I thought, are they sending me this because they think I'm incompetent or because they think I'm an asshole? And surely
Right.
those are not my two choices. And that
Right.
was, I didn't learn anything about management at business school, but I did learn about the 2x2 framework. And that was sort of
Yes.
how I started thinking myself out of this. And so radical candor is about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. And when you can do both at the same time, that's radical candor. But all of us fail on one of these dimensions or another. So when you challenge directly, but you fail to show that you care personally, that I call obnoxious aggression. And
Mhm.
actually, in earlier versions of the book and drafts of the book, I called that asshole or bosshole or whatever. But I
Mhm.
stopped doing that, and I stopped doing it for a really important reason, because I want people to use this 2x2 not as another Myers-Briggs personality test, right?
Right.
Don't
Okay.
start writing names in boxes, but rather to avoid making mistakes, because these are mistakes that all of us, whether we're the boss or not, make
Mhm.
all the time.
Okay.
So that's obnoxious aggression. Now, obnoxious aggression is problematic because it hurts people. It's also problematic because it's inefficient. When you act like a jerk, the other person goes into fight or flight mode, and they literally can't hear what you're saying, so you're
Mhm.
wasting your breath. And it's also problematic for a more subtle reason. I don't know about you all, but when I realize that I've acted like a jerk, which I do, I try not to, but I do.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's not my instinct to go the right way on care personally. Instead, it's my instinct to go the wrong way on challenge directly. Oh, it doesn't matter. It's no big deal. But it does matter, and it is a big deal. That's why I just said it, And then I wind up in the worst place of all, manipulative insincerity.
Mhm.
So
Mm.
if obnoxious aggression is front stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing.
Right.
And those are the kind of behaviors that make a workplace most toxic. Like, if we talk about what goes wrong about work, we're probably talking about manipulative insincerity or obnoxious aggression, because that's where the drama is.
Mhm.
But in my experience, and I'd be curious to hear about what you all think, the vast majority of people make the vast majority of mistakes in this other quadrant, where they do remember to show that they care personally, but they're so worried about not hurting someone's feelings that they fail to tell them something they'd be better off knowing in the long run. And that's what I call ruinous empathy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's what it is and what it isn't in a nutshell. And sometimes people, if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And sometimes people will tell me that someone will charge into a conference room and say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they'll proceed to act like a garden variety jerk. And that is not the spirit of radical. That's the spirit of
Mhm.
obnoxious aggression. So
Right.
I
That's
just want to
right.
make that clear.
So I don't want you to get mad at me, Kim. And I know
I will not
the
get mad.
quadrants were not intended to put people into. However, I couldn't read them and really get into your lessons without thinking of people.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, that this person was definitely demonstrating manipulative insincerity. However,
Yes.
we
Mhm.
talk about trying to help managers and supervisors stay out of the boss hole zone.
Yeah.
And to me, radical candor, that is staying out of the boss hole zone. And the other three, to some degree, that is the boss hole zone. And
Yeah.
nobody is born to be a boss hole. We always emphasize that.
Mhm.
But sometimes circumstances, too much power, too many direct reports, no training, they end up there and they don't
Yeah.
even realize it. But I love that you've given it a framework that people can reflect on and go, "Oh my gosh, am I doing that?"
Yeah.
And Kim, you've given people, and everybody go to the show notes because all of this information will be in there. You've given them a great way to reflect and think about, how am I showing up with these folks? And it's so practical.
Yeah, I really, I have to give there was a guy who worked for me at Google, Daniel Rubin, And he helped me edit the book. And
Mm-hmm.
he's a lot younger than I am. And he was full of radical candor for me. And he kept telling me, I don't know what to do. This makes sense, but I don't know what to do. So to the extent that there are practical tips, we all owe Daniel Rubin a great shout out of thanks.
No, that's great.
Well, and Kim, you mentioned the software company you started. I was reading about something that may have happened as a precursor to you
Yes.
starting your software company. You had a boss hole encounter. You write about it in your book. Can you share a little bit about that experience?
Yeah.
And
Without any direct names, of course.
Yeah. We're because actually there's lots. I'll tell you, there's lots more to the story than I had written before in the book.
Right.
But so
Of
I
course.
was working for this guy who was really belittling. In fact, and sometimes that kind of behavior, it shows up in your body. I actually shrank half an inch. Literally, I went to the doctor. She couldn't believe it. She said, well, you've got to quit this job. But anyway,
Yeah.
he would do so. He said something incredibly rude about me in an email to someone else. And somehow there was a BCC situation, and I wound up seeing the email, and I went and I confronted him about it, and he said, "Oh, just don't worry your pretty little head about it." And then later on I said, I feel like you don't respect me. And he said, I don't feel like you respect me and my superiority, basically.
Wow.
It was really bad. It
Yeah.
was a terrible situation. So
But I think it spurred the mission and just confirmed your passion for creating a workplace where people can love each other.
Yeah.
Certainly, but
or at
also,
least care, at least show common human
Right.
decency. I mean, that was in fact, in this moment where there have been so many layoffs, it was a layoff that manager conducted horribly
Mm-hmm.
that made me realize how important good management is
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
and how damaging bad management can be. It was really, and that was kind of the moment where I realized that management was not, it was actually interesting and it mattered.
And we will be right back.
With employee disengagement at its highest level in 9 years, your company can't afford to miss the mark when it comes to optimizing your hiring, management, and team performance practices. At its lowest level, employee turnover costs you $11,000 per person. And those are dollars you can easily save with the right set of people analytics. Real Good Ventures is a talent optimization consultancy specializing in world-class analytics specific to your people and the critical role they play within your organization. Gain confidence in your hiring practices, keep the boss holes from driving your talent away, design your teams for flawless execution, and create a culture that offers meaning and fulfillment. Real Good Ventures has a family of validated diagnostic tools specific to the human aspect of business, because we know that all business issues are people issues. Visit us today at www.realgoodventures.com and bring meaning and fulfillment back into your workplace.
Okay, let's get back to the program. Well, Kim, you can look back on this now, and you said there's a lot more to this story. Clearly, you have recovered, or you've moved on. However, I don't think this should be lost. We've had people come on and share their boss hole stories. There is real misery. I mean, there is harm being done to people, emotionally, physically, psychologically, and just because of people that don't understand that they're just acting like boss holes, or they have no knowledge of how to be better at what they're doing.
Yeah. No, and the sort of more to the story part was I bumped into him like 10 years later. And I'm laughing at it. It's a funny story now. It was not funny at the time. I mean, when you're shrinking and I'm only 5 feet tall, I did not have half an inch to give. When the way that you're being treated is making itself manifest in your body. And I've talked to people who get insomnia, they break out in hives. I mean, it really is true harm.
Mm-hmm.
There's also evidence that shows that people are more likely to have heart attacks, probably not in their 20s as I was at the time, but later. So it's a serious thing. But I bumped into him 10 years later, and we had a drink. And I realized, like, in my mind, he was the devil.
Mhm.
I had, and then I realized he wasn't. He was even younger than I was at the time when he was running this company. He had no idea what he was doing and nobody to teach him. And he had too much power.
Mhm.
It's a bad combo, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Ignorance and power are it's a bad
Not good.
cocktail.
Not
Not
good.
good. Well, and that's an example. There are others. You lived through other more egregious violations, if you will,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
weren't just about, your spirit or your reputation. They were about your livelihood, your womanhood, all of that. You write about that in Just Work. I think that's where I'd love to go next. How we can recognize, attack, and eliminate workplace injustice. So at the end of the day, we really are talking about inequality, injustice, ignorance. It could be a cover for all of that in some cases. But what moved you in this direction to be even more specific about what we have to shift in the workplace?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, when you write a book about feedback, you get a lot of it. And
Oh yeah.
and indeed I did. And by far the most valuable feedback I got was when I was giving a radical candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person who I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And when I finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm excited to roll out radical candor, but I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype.
Mhm.
And I knew this was true.
Mhm.
And it made me have 4 realizations at the same time. The first was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be, that I want to be.
Mm.
I hadn't even noticed the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant at every meeting we were ever in together, even though she had what to be ticked off about, as we all do at work.
Mhm.
The second thing I realized was that I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a woman in the workplace. And I think in part because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, that I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And so I
Right.
had been even deeper in denial about the ways in which I had caused harm. I hadn't intended to, but I had exhibited sort of the bias, prejudice, and bullying that had caused people to slime my colleague with that stereotype. And then the fourth thing I realized was that as a leader, I had failed to do what I needed to do to prevent these things from happening on my watch,
Sure.
as almost all leaders do, actually. And I thought that that was kind of the moment when I decided to write
Mm.
Just Work.
Mhm.
Because I needed to come to grips with these things that I had been I had gone through so much of my career kind of la 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 pretending that things weren't happening. And
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge that in some respects that was useful, because I think there were some things that had happened that were so painful and upsetting that I couldn't come to grips with them. And I'm not saying denial is like a great way of coping, but I also want to offer some compassion for people
Mhm.
who are sometimes in denial about the things that are happening to them. So
Right.
when you're the person harmed, you get to choose your response. But if you're the upstander, you need to intervene. You don't get to be in denial. And
Right.
if you're the
Well,
leader, you definitely don't get to be in denial.
that's right. And upstander and that whole idea jumped out to me when I read the book. I have a big sticky note over here.
Oh,
That was
thank you.
my neck. What a great segue. I wanted to ask you, how do people become upstanders? Give us some practical advice about, joining in a way to be part of the solution in a way that doesn't mean we have to change who we are or what we do. Give us your take on the upstander.
Yeah. I think you probably do have to change some things, but you want to become your best self, not your worst self.
There you
Mhm.
go.
I'll put it that
Well
way.
said. Yeah.
And so I think that in order to be an upstander, first of all, remember what you're doing is you're intervening when something's going wrong. You're not like going in to be the Incredible Hulk or the hero.
Yes.
You're not an Avenger, and you're also not standing up for someone who's weaker than you. You're not casting
Right.
other people in the role of damsel in distress, or you're not giving into the white savior complex or something like that. So
Right.
what can you do? What when you want to sort of create a better workplace? I think one of the problems is that we often conflate bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they're the same thing. And they're actually three very different things, and we need three very different responses. So I'm going to offer you some, if I may, some really simple definitions. Overly
yeah.
simple, but useful in the moment.
We like
So
simple. Simple
yeah,
is good.
simple. Yeah, simple is good. There's more to it, and I'm not saying ignore all the more to it, but let's sort of disambiguate. Bias is not meaning it. It's usually unconscious. You don't really mean what you're saying. Whereas prejudice is meaning it.
Mhm.
It's a very consciously held belief. And bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, going on. You're just being mean. So
Mhm.
not meaning it is bias, meaning it is prejudice, being mean is bullying. And
Mhm.
thinking about how to respond differently to each is useful. So let's start with bias. One of my favorite stories comes from Aileen Lee, who started Cowboy VC. She said she was going into a meeting with two colleagues who were men, and they sat down at a big, long conference table, and the other side started filing in, and the first person sat across from the guy to Aileen's left. The next person came in and sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. So how many
Mhm.
times is that how bias shows up? Just in who decides to sit across from whom.
Mhm.
Right.
But Aileen was undeterred. She knew she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal, so she started talking. And when the other side had questions, they didn't direct them at Aileen, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men. Another common way that bias shows up. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time, and finally her colleague stood up and he said, "I think Aileen and I should switch seats." That was all he had to do to
Awesome.
totally change the dynamic in the room, because all of a sudden everybody else realized what they were doing.
Yeah.
They felt a little embarrassed, but they changed it,
Got
and
you.
so yeah, that's what an I statement does. It kind of holds a mirror up to the other side to understand things the way that you do. It sort of calls people in.
Yes.
But if it's prejudice, holding a mirror up is not going to work, because the person's going to grin in the mirror. They're going to like what they see.
Mhm.
That's the way they want it. So if it's prejudice, you need an it statement. And an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So an example of that, a colleague of mine was in a hiring meeting, and everyone who had interviewed all the colleagues agreed that, all the candidates agreed that the most qualified person for the role was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally. And the hiring manager said, "Oh, well, we can't extend her an offer." And my colleague said, "Well, why not?" And the hiring manager, and this is at like a very well-known, well-respected company,
Mhm.
and recently, not in the 1960s. And the hiring manager said, "Well, I'm not going to put that hair in front of the business." And believe me, nowhere in the job requirements was there anything about hair. This was a financial services firm, and so what was an it statement that could be
Mhm.
used? It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state, thanks to the Crown Act. Or she could have appealed to an HR policy. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair.
Yeah.
Or if she had lived in a place where she didn't, or worked in a place where she didn't have the law or the HR policy in place, she could have said, "It is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their
Mhm.
hair."
Because of the hair,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So an it statement sort of makes it clear where the line is between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on other people.
Mhm.
Oh, that's
So
so
that's
perfect. Yes.
That's easier said than done.
Right.
I tell this anecdote, but I had to think a long time to find it. So we'll talk in a minute about what leaders can do to make sure that
Mhm.
upstanders stand up more often. Now, in the case of bullying, you want a you statement. You don't want an I statement, because an I statement sort of invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. And that's not what you want to do in the case of a bully. My daughter taught me this when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied, and I was encouraging her to say about this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? I thought,
Wow.
that's a really good point.
It is.
Yeah. Wow.
And so we talked about saying, why are you doing this? Or what's
Mhm.
going on for you here? Sometimes, actually, I learned this from, and there's a New York Times article about a dominatrix who taught people this trick. Just change the subject. Ask a question about them. Where'd you get that shirt? That all of a sudden puts you in an active stance. You're no longer in the submissive role when you're asking a question to someone.
Mhm.
Where'd you get that shirt? So try a you question or a you statement, a you response if you think it's bullying. There's a great organization that came up with the 5 Ds for upstanders. So how can you stand up to bullying or bias or prejudice? Sometimes it's a direct response, the I, the it, the you statement. But other times you might feel like you will get, there will be repercussions for you.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And, I wrote this book in part in honor of upstanders. I don't want to put upstanders in harm's way. Some people have written in and said, I upstood and I got fired. So I want to acknowledge the power dynamics. But there are other things you can do to intervene that aren't direct. You can delegate. You can ask someone else to intervene.
Mhm.
You can also delay. You can check in with the person later and see if they're okay. You can document what happened. That can also often, you don't want to post it on social media, because the person who owns that documentation is the person who was harmed, not you.
Mhm.
That's right.
But that can be really, really helpful. Or you can just distract. There's a New York Times article about someone on the subway. A man was following a woman and she was afraid of him, clearly, and the things were starting to get physical, and he just threw his potato chips all over the place, and it created a distraction and allowed her to get away. He didn't want to fight this guy, but he also didn't want to do nothing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the 5 Ds, I think, give people different ways to think about intervening when they notice bias, prejudice, or bullying.
Kim, you said something that I think is really helpful and a huge takeaway for our listeners, our managers and supervisors out there. Leaders have to be, I don't know if it's an oversensitivity. They just need to be aware and listening and cognizant of bias, prejudice, or bullying that may be taking place within the team. And when you talk about leaders, especially,
Yeah.
they really need to be mindful of what's happening in the workplace, correct?
Yes, they need to be mindful, but that's not enough. They also need to put systems in place that are going to make it more likely that people intervene.
Like I said, timeless wisdom from Kim Scott. You can see why I wanted to bring this back up for a flashback. So make sure you go into the show notes and listen to part 2 of that particular interview with Kim Scott and look at the resources that are available, and especially her new book, Radical Respect. Keep checking back to the Boss Hole Chronicles. We'll see you soon.